Welcome to her journey, where every story is a testament to the power of perseverance, hope, and the unstoppable spirit of women. Here, we share true tales of resilience and reinvention, stories that prove, no matter how dark the night, a woman's dawn can always break through. If you believe in the beauty of comebacks and the power of second chances, you're in the right place. The train pulled away from the platform, leaving me standing there with nothing but the clothes on my back and $17 in my purse. At 72 years old, I watched my son's husband drive away without a backward glance, abandoning me 300 miles from home like I was nothing more than trash to be discarded. My name is Melinda Whitmore, and this is the story of how being left for dead led me to discover a power I never knew I possessed. If stories of resilience, transformation, and a woman's quiet revenge through success inspire you, please subscribe to her journey and hit the notification bell so you never miss a tale that just might change your life. My life had become smaller than I ever imagined it could be. At 72, I lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Iowa, surviving on my late husband Robert's Social Security and a tiny pension that barely covered my medications. The walls of my one-bedroom apartment seemed to close in a little more each day, decorated with photographs of a life that felt increasingly distant. My wedding day 49 years ago, my son Daniel's graduation, holidays when we were still a family. Robert had been gone for 3 years now, taken by a sudden heart attack that left me not just grieving, but financially devastated. We'd spent our savings on his medical treatments in those final months, and what little remained had gone to funeral expenses and settling debts I hadn't even known existed. The man I'd trusted with everything had been hiding our financial struggles from me, trying to protect me, he'd said in those final fevered conversations, but leaving me unprepared for the reality of widowhood. Daniel, my only child, lived 4 hours away in Chicago with his husband Bradley. My relationship with my son had grown complicated since his marriage 5 years ago. Not because he was gay, I'd known that since he was 16 and loved him just the same, but because Bradley had a way of making me feel like an unwelcome intrusion in their perfectly curated life. Bradley worked in finance, something high-level and important that he never explained in terms I could understand. He dressed in expensive suits, drove a BMW, and had opinions about everything from wine to politics to the proper way to arrange furniture. He was handsome in that polished, artificial way that comes from good genes and better dental work, but his eyes were cold when he looked at me. Always calculating, always finding me wanting. Mother needs to understand. I'd overheard him telling Daniel during their last visit that we can't be expected to support her indefinitely. We have our own lives to consider. Daniel had murmured something in response I couldn't quite catch, but the tone was apologetic. Ashamed. Of me. I'd stopped asking them for help after that, even when the heating bill in January left me choosing between warmth and groceries. Pride, perhaps, or stubbornness. My mother had always said the Whitmore women were too proud for their own good, and maybe she was right. But I couldn't bear the thought of being seen as a burden, of giving Bradley more ammunition for his campaign to convince Daniel that his mother was a liability. The apartment was clean but sparse. I'd sold most of our good furniture in those desperate months after Robert's death, keeping only what fit in this smaller space and what held too much sentimental value to part with. The china cabinet where I'd once displayed my mother's wedding set now held mismatched dishes from the thrift store. The walls were bare except for those photographs and a landscape painting Robert had bought me for our 10th anniversary, a rolling meadow with wildflowers that reminded him of where we'd had our first picnic. My days followed a routine born of necessity and loneliness. Morning coffee with yesterday's newspaper, found abandoned in the lobby. A walk to the small market 6 blocks away, where I could stretch a $20 bill across 3 days of simple meals. Afternoons spent reading library books or watching game shows on the small television that had been Robert's prized possession. Evenings cooking dinner for one on the hot plate that substituted for the full kitchen I'd once taken for granted. I'd applied for assistance, of course. Stood in line at the welfare office with my carefully organized paperwork, enduring the suspicious looks of clerks young enough to be my grandchildren. The food stamps helped, but they came with a side of humiliation that never got easier to swallow. The housing assistance had a waiting list 3 years long. Medicare covered some of my medications, but not all, and certainly not the dental work I desperately needed. The worst part wasn't the poverty itself, though that was hard enough. It was the invisibility. At 72, I discovered that society had no use for women like me. Widowed, poor, past the age where my opinions or experiences mattered to anyone. I'd become a ghost in my own life, shuffling through days that blended into one another with nothing to distinguish Tuesday from Thursday except the different programming on television. But there were moments, usually late at night when sleep eluded me, when I remembered the woman I used to be. The girl who'd graduated valedictorian from high school with plans to study literature. The young woman who'd worked as a secretary to put Robert through engineering school, managing our meager budget with the precision of a mathematician. The mother who'd raised Daniel to be kind and thoughtful and generous, traits that seemed to have gotten buried somewhere beneath Bradley's influence and the demands of their sophisticated urban life. That woman felt like a character from a book I'd read long ago, someone whose story I could remember, but whose reality I could no longer quite believe in. How had she become this? How had a life that had once held so much promise and love condensed down to this small apartment, these small concerns, this small existence? I told myself I was grateful. Grateful to have a roof over my head when so many women my age were living in their cars or on the streets. Grateful for my health, mostly, though the arthritis in my hands made simple tasks painful, and the occasional chest pains reminded me that I was not as young as I sometimes still felt in my mind. Grateful that Daniel called every few weeks, even if those conversations were stilted and brief, full of careful questions about my well-being that seemed designed more to assuage his guilt than to actually connect with me. But gratitude, I was learning, was a poor substitute for purpose. And purpose was what I missed most about my old life. The sense that I mattered, that my actions had consequences, that there were people who needed me and things I was uniquely qualified to do. Now my primary accomplishment each day was making it to bedtime without spending money I didn't have or bothering anyone with problems they couldn't solve. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday in late September. I was sorting through a bag of groceries I'd bought with the last of my food stamps when it rang, the shrill sound startling in the quiet apartment. "Mom." Daniel's voice was strained, unusual for him. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you something." "You're never a bother, sweetheart," I said, settling into my one good chair. "What's wrong?" "It's not wrong, exactly. It's just, well, Bradley has a work conference in Minneapolis this weekend, and we thought maybe you'd like to come with us. Make a little trip out of it." I was so surprised I nearly dropped the phone. Daniel and Bradley hadn't invited me anywhere in over a year, not since a disastrous Christmas dinner where I'd apparently used the wrong fork for the salad course, and Bradley had spent the rest of the evening making pointed comments about proper etiquette. "That's very thoughtful," I said carefully. "But I can't really afford." "Oh, we'd cover the travel expenses," Daniel interrupted quickly. "Bradley thinks the change of scenery might be good for you. And we could spend some real time together, just the three of us." Something in his tone was off, too eager, too bright. But the prospect of leaving this apartment, of seeing something beyond these four walls and the familiar route to the grocery store, was too tempting to examine too closely. "I'd love that," I said, and meant it. "When would we leave?" "Friday morning. Bradley wants to drive, so he can have the car while he's at his conference. We'd pick you up around 8. We talked for a few more minutes about what I should pack and what the weather might be like, but underneath the mundane details, I kept hearing that strange note in Daniel's voice. Nervous.
Guilty.
Like a child who'd been caught in a lie but was hoping to smooth it over with good behavior. I should have trusted that instinct. Should have asked more questions, demanded more details, insisted on understanding exactly what this trip was really about. But I was so starved for connection, so desperate for evidence that I still mattered to my son, that I pushed down the doubts and focused instead on the prospect of 3 days away from this lonely apartment. As I hung up the phone and went back to putting away groceries, I found myself humming for the first time in months. A little trip. Time with Daniel. Maybe even a chance to bridge whatever gap had grown between us, to remind him of the mother who'd read him bedtime stories and cheered at his soccer games, and held him when his heart was broken by his first love. I had no way of knowing that this trip would strip away everything I thought I knew about my life, my son, and myself. That in 3 days, I would discover both the depths of betrayal and the heights of my own hidden power. That the woman who packed a small suitcase with her few good clothes and carefully counted out bus fare for emergencies would return as someone else entirely. If I had known, would I have said yes? Would I have climbed into that car on Friday morning with such hope in my heart? I think I would have, because sometimes the only way to discover who you really are is to lose everything you thought defined you. The drive to Minneapolis started pleasantly enough. Bradley was in one of his charming moods, the kind that had probably won over Daniel in the first place, regaling us with stories from his office and asking surprisingly thoughtful questions about my week. He'd even stopped for coffee at a place I'd mentioned liking, though he'd made a show of checking his watch as we waited in line. "This is nice," I ventured from the back seat as we merged onto the interstate. "I haven't been anywhere in so long." "We should do this more often," Daniel said, catching my eye in the rearview mirror. But there was something forced about his smile, something that didn't quite reach his eyes. Bradley's conference was at one of those gleaming downtown hotels that charged more per night than I spent on groceries in a month. The lobby was all marble and crystal, filled with men in expensive suits carrying leather briefcases and speaking in the confident tones of people accustomed to being heard. I felt underdressed in my best blouse and the slacks I'd bought at Goodwill, but Daniel kept his hand on my elbow as we walked to the front desk, studying me on the polished floors. 2 rooms, Bradley told the clerk. Morrison and Whitmore. Actually, the clerk said after consulting his computer, I show 1 room under Morrison and then Mrs. Whitmore for the Continental in across town. My stomach dropped. Across town. Bradley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There must be some confusion. Let me speak to your manager. But after 10 minutes of increasingly tense conversation, the facts became clear. There was no room for me at this hotel. There never had been. The Continental Inn was a budget motel in a part of town that the concierge reluctantly admitted was transitional. "It's fine," I said quickly, seeing the embarrassment on Daniel's face. "I don't need anything fancy." "Mom, I'm so sorry," Daniel said. There must have been a mix-up with the reservations. But Bradley was already pulling out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen with the efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems with money and authority. "The Continental will be adequate for 1 night," he said without looking up. "We'll sort this out tomorrow." The Continental Inn was everything the concierge's carefully diplomatic language had implied. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with weeds growing through the gaps. The neon sign flickered intermittently, missing several letters. The lobby smelled of disinfectant that couldn't quite mask something else, something that spoke of desperation and temporary arrangements. But my room was clean, if sparse, and the bed was comfortable enough. I unpacked my few things and tried to push down the disappointment. This was still better than sitting alone in my apartment. I was still spending time with Daniel, even if the accommodations weren't what I'd expected. "We'll pick you up for dinner," Daniel had promised. 7 o'clock. At 6:30, I was ready, wearing the one dress I'd brought, and the pearl earrings that had been my mother's. At 7, I was waiting by the window, watching for Bradley's BMW. At 7:30, I called Daniel's phone. "Mom, I'm so sorry." His voice was rushed, apologetic. "Bradley's conference dinner is running long, and he needs me there for some business thing. Can we do breakfast instead? I'll make it up to you, I promise." "Of course," I said, though the disappointment was sharp. "These things happen. You're the best. I love you, Mom." But when I called the next morning at 9, then 10, then 11, the phone went straight to voicemail. When I finally reached the front desk at their hotel, I was told that Mr. Morrison and his guest had checked out early that morning. I stood in my motel room, holding the phone with shaking hands, trying to understand what was happening. They'd left without me. My son and his husband had driven 300 miles away and left me alone in a cheap motel with no way to get home. The first emotion was disbelief. This had to be another mix-up, another misunderstanding. Maybe they'd gone to get the car serviced or pick up something for the drive home. Maybe Daniel's phone had died, and he was frantically trying to find a way to reach me. But as the hours passed and my calls continued to go unanswered, disbelief gave way to a crushing realization. This hadn't been an accident. The separate hotel, the canceled dinner, the early departure, it had all been planned. They had brought me here specifically to abandon me. I sat on the edge of the motel bed and took inventory of my situation with the methodical precision that had once helped me stretch Robert's engineering salary to cover all our needs. I had $17 in my purse. I had a Greyhound bus station 3 miles away where a ticket home would cost $63. I had no way to call anyone who might help because there was no one to call. My sister lived in Florida on a fixed income as tight as mine had been. My few remaining friends from the old neighborhood had their own problems and wouldn't be able to wire money even if I could find a way to ask. The crushing weight of my situation settled over me like a physical thing. I was 72 years old, stranded 300 miles from home with no money and no way to get back. Worse than that, I'd been abandoned by the person I loved most in the world, the child I'd raised and sacrificed for and believed would always love me in return. That night, I lay in the motel bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the highway and the occasional argument from the room next door. I thought about calling the police, but what crime had been committed? I thought about calling social services, but the shame of admitting my situation to a stranger was almost unbearable. I thought about calling Daniel one more time, but the part of me that was still his mother couldn't bear to hear his voice try to explain why his husband had convinced him to throw me away like garbage. By morning, I'd made a decision. I walked to the front desk and asked about extending my stay. "How long you thinking?" the clerk asked, not looking up from his crossword puzzle. "I'm not sure yet," I said. "Maybe a few days while I sort some things out." He quoted me a weekly rate that would exhaust my $17 by Wednesday, but at least it would give me time to figure out what came next. I'd find a way to contact social services, swallow my pride, and ask for help getting home. Then I'd have to figure out how to rebuild what was left of my life with the knowledge that my son could abandon me when I became inconvenient. But as I signed the registration form with a pen that skipped and left gaps in my signature, something else was stirring beneath the despair and humiliation. Something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was like. Anger. Not the hot, immediate anger of a moment's frustration, but the cold, calculating anger of someone who'd been pushed too far. The kind of anger that could burn for years without consuming itself, that could plan and wait and strike when the time was right. Bradley Morrison had no idea who he decided to throw away. He saw an elderly woman with worn clothes and humble circumstances, someone disposable and forgettable. He didn't know about the girl who'd graduated valedictorian, the young woman who'd managed household finances with the precision of a CPA, the mother who'd moved heaven and earth to give her son every opportunity. He certainly didn't know about the secret I'd been keeping for 37 years, the one thing I never told Robert or Daniel or anyone else. The thing that could change everything if I decided to use it. But that would come later. First, I had to survive this. First, I had to find a way home from this godforsaken motel with my dignity intact and my pride, if not unbruised, then at least unbowed. I had no idea that within 24 hours, I would make a phone call that would transform not just my circumstances, but my understanding of who I'd been all along. That the woman checking into an extended stay at the Continental Inn would emerge as someone Daniel and Bradley had never imagined existed. The game was about to change, and I was tired of playing by other people's rules. The first week at the Continental Inn taught me things about desperation I never wanted to learn. I discovered that a person could survive on gas station coffee and vending machine crackers longer than seemed possible. That pride becomes a luxury you can't afford when you're counting pennies for the payphone. That the sound of a door slamming in the middle of the night could make you lie awake wondering if today would be the day you'd finally run out of options. I called Daniel obsessively those first few days, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that went unanswered. "Sweetheart, there's been some kind of mistake," I said to his machine on Monday. By Wednesday, my messages had evolved to simple pleas. "Daniel, please. I just need to know you're all right. I just need to come home." But the silence was absolute. It was as if I'd never existed at all. The other residents of the Continental Inn existed in various states of temporary desperation. There was Maria, the young mother with 2 kids under 5 who'd been there since her boyfriend kicked her out 3 months ago. She worked double shifts at a fast food place, saving every penny she could for a security deposit on an apartment she might never be able to afford. Her children played in the parking lot with toys made from empty boxes, and she fed them dinner from the microwave in the front office because her room didn't have a kitchen. There was Frank, the veteran who talked to himself and sometimes shouted at invisible enemies in the middle of the night. He'd been there 2 years, the desk clerk told me, ever since his disability payments got tangled up in some bureaucratic nightmare that no one seemed able or willing to sort out. He was harmless, they assured me, just broken in ways that couldn't be fixed with good intentions and temporary solutions. And there was Janet, closest to my age at 68, who'd ended up here after her daughter cleaned out her bank account and left her with nothing but a car that barely ran and a suitcase full of photograph memories. She spent her days applying for jobs that wouldn't hire someone her age and her evenings in the office, watching whatever was on the communal television, because the loneliness in her room was too heavy to bear alone. The thing is, Janet told me one evening as we shared a package of store-brand cookies I'd splurged on, "I keep thinking this is temporary. Like someone's going to call and say there's been a mistake, and I can go back to my real life. But maybe this is my real life now. Maybe everything before was just borrowing time." I understood exactly what she meant. Every morning I woke up expecting this to be a bad dream, expecting Daniel to call with explanations and apologies, expecting Bradley to reveal that this had all been some twisted test of my character that I'd somehow passed. But the days kept dawning gray and empty, and the phone stayed silent, and slowly I began to accept that my old life was over. The extended stay rate ran out on Thursday, and I had to make a choice: spend my last few dollars on another week or find somewhere else to go. The homeless shelter was 15 miles away with a waiting list and restrictions that seemed designed to exclude as many people as possible. The Salvation Army might help with a bus ticket home, but I'd have to prove I had somewhere to go, someone willing to take me in. That was when the full scope of my isolation became clear. I'd spent my adult life so focused on Robert and Daniel that I never cultivated the kind of friendships that might sustain me through a crisis like this. The neighbors from our old house had their own problems and barely knew me as anything more than Robert's wife. The ladies from the church auxiliary had scattered to assisted living facilities or their children's spare bedrooms, their carefully maintained social connections dissolved by time and circumstances. I was truly alone in the world, perhaps for the first time in my 72 years. That realization should have been devastating. Instead, it was oddly liberating. When you have nothing left to lose, you stop worrying about what other people think. When you've been discarded by the person whose opinion mattered most, everyone else's judgment loses its power to wound you. On Friday morning, I put on my best blouse and walked to the bank downtown. My hands shook as I explained my situation to the young teller, but my voice was steady. I needed to access my account to buy a bus ticket home. I had identification, I had account numbers, I could answer any security questions they wanted to ask. "Ma'am, I'm showing a balance of $12.37, the teller said gently. "That's not enough for a Greyhound ticket to Cedar Falls."
$12.
In my desperation to extend my stay at the motel, I'd forgotten about the automatic deductions that came out of my account each month. The insurance payment, the small charity contribution I'd never canceled, the bank fees that seemed to multiply like parasites when your balance dropped below their arbitrary minimum. I stood at that bank counter with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the security guard eyeing me with polite suspicion, and felt the last of my old self crumble away. The woman who'd walked into this bank was someone who still believed she had options, still believed that things would work out if she just tried hard enough. The woman who walked out was someone else entirely. That afternoon, I made the call I'd been dreading. Social services in Hennepin County were efficient, if not particularly sympathetic. They could help me with temporary housing while they processed my case, but it would take time. Weeks, maybe months. There would be paperwork, interviews, assessments of my mental competency and physical needs. I would become a case number in a system designed to warehouse people society had no other use for. The good news, the caseworker said with practiced cheerfulness, is that you qualify for several assistance programs. Food stamps, housing assistance, medical coverage. We can get you stabilized.
Stabilized.
As if I were a chemical compound in danger of decomposing, rather than a human being who'd been thrown away like trash. That night, I sat in my motel room with a stack of forms that seemed designed to reduce my entire life to a series of boxes to be checked and income levels to be verified. Have you been the victim of domestic violence? Have you been diagnosed with any mental health conditions? Do you have any assets not previously disclosed? Assets. The word stopped me cold, my pen hovering over the form like a divining rod sensing water. I did have assets. One asset, to be precise. One secret I'd kept for 37 years, buried so deep in my consciousness that I'd almost convinced myself it didn't exist. But sitting in that motel room, with nothing but forms and desperation for company, I allowed myself to remember. 1987, Daniel was 15, Robert was working overtime to pay for his college preparatory courses, and I was supplementing our income by doing bookkeeping for small businesses in the evening after my day job. One of my clients was an elderly man named Harrison Walsh, who owned a small manufacturing company he'd inherited from his father. Harrison was kind but disorganized, the type of person who kept important papers in shoe boxes and made business decisions based on intuition rather than analysis. His company manufactured small electronic components, nothing glamorous, but it was profitable in a quiet, steady way that appealed to engineers and accountants. When he died suddenly of a stroke, he left behind a will that surprised everyone, including me. He'd never married, had no children, and his only living relative was a nephew in California who'd never shown any interest in the business. The bulk of his estate, including the company, went to various charities. But there was one small bequest that no one else knew about: 10,000 shares of stock in Walsh Manufacturing, left to Melinda Whitmore, in appreciation of her integrity and friendship during my final years. 10,000 shares of a small, privately held company that manufactured electronic components. At the time, the shares were worth perhaps $50,000, a fortune to someone like me, but not enough to dramatically change our circumstances. Robert and I discussed it and decided to hold on to the stock rather than sell it. We were young enough that we didn't need the money immediately, and Harrison had always said the company had growth potential. Then life got complicated. Daniel's college expenses, Robert's heart problems, the gradual financial decline that consumed all our attention and energy. The stock certificates went into our safety deposit box, and I honestly forgot about them. When Robert died, and I was drowning in medical bills and funeral expenses, I never thought to check if those shares were worth anything. But sitting in that motel room, with social services forms spread across the bed and my stomach empty because I'd skipped dinner to make my money last another day, I remembered. And for the first time in a week, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe Harrison's optimism about his company's future had been justified. Maybe those shares were worth something more than the sentimental value I'd assigned them. Maybe the woman everyone had written off as disposable had resources they'd never imagined. The next morning, I would make a phone call that would change everything. But that night, I fell asleep clutching those forms and dreaming of a phone booth in Cedar Falls where 10,000 shares of forgotten stock waited to reveal their secrets. I had no idea that I was about to discover the difference between being abandoned and choosing to disappear. The public library opened at 9 a.m. on Saturday morning, and I was waiting by the front doors like a woman possessed. The librarian, a kind-faced woman named Patricia, who couldn't have been much younger than me, showed me to a computer terminal and patiently explained how to access the internet. "I need to look up information about a company," I told her. "Walsh Manufacturing. It's probably been sold or something by now, but I just need to know." Patricia helped me navigate to a business database, her fingers flying over the keyboard with the confidence of someone who'd helped countless patrons bridge the gap between the analog world they'd grown up in and the digital reality that had emerged around them. "Let's see what we can find," she murmured, typing in search terms and adjusting parameters I didn't understand. "Walsh Manufacturing. Looks like there are several companies with that name. Do you know what they manufactured?" "Electronic components," I said. "Small stuff for computers and machines. The owner died in 1987, so it might not even exist anymore." But as the search results populated the screen, I felt my breath catch. There it was, Walsh Manufacturing Incorporated, founded in 1962, headquarters Minneapolis, Minnesota. And according to the latest financial filings, it was not only still in business, it was thriving. "Oh my," Patricia said softly. "This is interesting." The company I remembered as Harrison's small family business had grown into something I barely recognized. The electronic components division had evolved into cutting-edge technology for medical devices and aerospace applications. There had been mergers, acquisitions, partnerships with major corporations I'd heard of even in my limited exposure to business news. And then Patricia found the news that made my hands start shaking. Walsh Manufacturing acquired by TechCore Industries for $2.8 billion. $2.8 billion. The acquisition had been completed just 6 months ago, meaning shareholders had received payouts based on the final sale price. But I needed to know what that meant for someone who owned 10,000 shares of a company that had been growing steadily for 37 years. "Is there a way to find out what individual shares would be worth?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Patricia's eyes were kind but curious as she helped me navigate to financial sites that tracked stock splits, dividends, and acquisition payouts. It took nearly 2 hours of searching and calculating, with Patricia patiently explaining terms like stock splits and dividend reinvestment that might as well have been foreign languages. But slowly, the picture became clear. Those 10,000 shares had split multiple times over the decades. Dividends had been automatically reinvested, buying more shares that split again. The modest investment Harrison had left me had grown into something that defied comprehension. When the final calculation appeared on the screen, I stared at it for so long that Patricia asked if I was all right.
"Mom?
"Are you feeling okay? Should I call someone?" $12,400,000. That's what my shares were worth when TechCore Industries acquired Walsh Manufacturing. $12,400,000 that had been sitting in a brokerage account I'd forgotten existed, accumulating interest and growing through reinvestment while I counted pennies for bus fare. I was rich, not just comfortable or financially secure, but genuinely, life-changingly wealthy. Rich enough to buy Daniel's house in Chicago and Bradley's BMW, and still have millions left over. Rich enough to never worry about heating bills or grocery money or whether I could afford my medications. Rich enough to make the people who'd abandoned me very, very sorry. I need to make some phone calls, I told Patricia, my voice surprisingly steady considering that my entire world had just shifted on its axis. The first call was to the brokerage firm that had been managing the Walsh Manufacturing account. After 20 minutes of identity verification and security questions, I was transferred to a senior account manager named James Crawford who spoke in the hushed, reverential tones reserved for clients with 8-figure portfolios. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have to say, we've been trying to reach you for months," he said. "The acquisition payout was processed 6 months ago, but all our correspondence has been returned as undeliverable. Your account has been earning interest, of course, but we really need to update your contact information and discuss your investment strategy going forward." My investment strategy. As if I were the kind of person who had investment strategies instead of strategies for making a $20 bill last 4 days. "I've had some life changes recently," I said. "Can you tell me exactly what my account balance is as of today?" "Certainly. Your current balance is $12,437,218.46. And that's just in the money market account where we deposited the acquisition proceeds. If you'd like to discuss diversifying your portfolio, I can schedule you with one of our wealth management specialists." Wealth management specialists. I was somebody who needed wealth management specialists. "Mr. Crawford," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, "I need to access some of these funds immediately. Is that possible?" "Of course. How much are you looking to withdraw?" I thought about the motel room where my few possessions were waiting, about the social services forms I'd abandoned on the bed, about Daniel and Bradley driving home from Minneapolis, congratulating themselves on how neatly they disposed of their unwanted burden. "Let's start with $50,000, I said. "I'll need it transferred to my checking account as soon as possible." "I can have that processed this afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore. The funds should be available by Monday morning." Monday morning. 2 days away, and then this nightmare would be over. But more than that, the game would begin. Because now I had something Daniel and Bradley didn't know I possessed. Power. The second call was to the nicest hotel in Minneapolis, the one where Bradley's conference had been held. "I'd like to book your best suite for tonight," I told the reservations clerk. "And I'll need transportation from the Continental Inn on University Avenue." "Certainly, ma'am. May I ask how many nights you'll be staying?" I looked around the public library, at Patricia, who was discreetly pretending not to listen to my conversation, at the afternoon light streaming through windows that overlooked a city where I'd been abandoned and humiliated just a week ago. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I suspect it's going to be longer than anyone expects." That afternoon, I checked out of the Continental Inn with a mixture of sadness and anticipation. I'd grown fond of Maria and Janet, and even Frank, these fellow travelers who'd shown me kindness when I had nothing to offer in return. Before I left, I stopped by the front office and had a quiet word with the manager. "I'd like to pay for Maria's room for the next 6 months, I said, sliding a check across his desk. "And Janet's. And Frank's too. They've been good neighbors." The manager stared at the check, the first one I'd written for my newly flush account, like it might be counterfeit. "Ma'am, this is very generous, but I have to ask if you're sure about this?" "I'm sure," I said. "And I'd prefer if they didn't know where it came from. Just tell them an anonymous benefactor wanted to help." As the hotel car pulled up to take me to my new accommodations, I felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was like. Anticipation. Not hope, exactly, because hope implied uncertainty about the outcome. This was something more powerful, the absolute certainty that I was about to take control of my own story for the first time in decades. The woman who'd checked into the Continental a week ago had been a victim, someone to whom things happened. The woman climbing into this car was someone who made things happen to other people. And Daniel and Bradley were about to discover just how expensive it could be to underestimate someone they should have loved. The penthouse suite at the Four Seasons was larger than the apartment I'd been living in for 3 years. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city where I'd been abandoned, now spread out below me like a map of possibilities. The marble bathroom had a soaking tub big enough for 2 people, and the kitchen was equipped with appliances that cost more than most people's cars. But it wasn't the luxury that made me feel powerful, it was the choice. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford or what other people expected of me. My first decision was to call room service and order everything that had sounded good but unattainable during my week at the Continental Inn. Lobster bisque, filet mignon, a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly grocery budget used to be. When the server arrived with a cart that looked like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant, I tipped him $100 just because I could. My second decision was to call a high-end department store and arrange for a personal shopper to bring me a complete wardrobe. "I'll need everything," I told the woman who answered, her voice immediately shifting to the deferent tone reserved for customers with unlimited budgets. "Business attire, casual clothes, evening wear, shoes, accessories. I'm starting over completely." "Of course, madam. What's your budget for this shopping experience?" "There isn't one," I said, and felt a thrill at the words. "Bring me the best you have." Within 2 hours, my suite was transformed into a boutique, with racks of clothing in rich fabrics and colors I'd never imagined wearing. The personal shopper, a woman named Christine who had the polished confidence of someone accustomed to wealthy clients, helped me select pieces that made me look like the successful woman I'd apparently always been without knowing it. "You have excellent bone structure," Christine said as I modeled a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I used to spend on clothes in a year. "These colors bring out your eyes beautifully." I stared at myself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. This wasn't the tired, worn-down widow who'd been counting pennies at the Continental Inn. This was someone who belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, someone whose opinions mattered and whose presence commanded respect. But beneath the expensive clothing and newfound confidence, something else was building, a plan. My third decision was to hire an investigator. Not just any investigator, but the best one money could buy. I found Hamilton Investigative Services through a simple internet search, but their client list included Fortune 500 companies and celebrities, protecting their reputations from scandal. If I was going to learn everything there was to know about Bradley Morrison's life, I wanted professionals handling the job. "Mrs. Whitmore," said Victoria Hamilton when I met with her the next morning in her downtown office, "I have to ask what kind of investigation you're looking for. Are we talking about background verification, financial irregularities, personal conduct?" Victoria was a woman about my age who transitioned from a career in federal law enforcement to private investigation. Her office was decorated with commendations and photographs of her with politicians and business leaders, but what impressed me most was the intelligence in her eyes and the way she listened without judgment to my story. "Everything," I said. "I want to know about his finances, his business dealings, his personal relationships. I want to know if there are any irregularities in his professional conduct, any skeletons in his closets, anything that might be interesting to the right people." "That's comprehensive," Victoria said carefully. "May I ask what you're planning to do with this information?" I'd thought about this question during my sleepless night in the Four Seasons king-sized bed. Bradley Morrison made a calculation about who I am and what I'm worth. He decided I was disposable, someone who could be abandoned without consequences. I'd like him to understand how wrong he was. Victoria smiled then, an expression that reminded me of a cat who'd spotted a particularly interesting mouse. I think we can help you with that, Mrs. Whitmore. When would you like us to start? Yesterday, I said. But this morning will have to do. While Victoria's team began their investigation, I started making other arrangements. I opened accounts at the most prestigious bank in Minneapolis, the kind of institution that assigned personal banking consultants to clients with seven-figure deposits. I hired a wealth management firm to handle my investments, a tax attorney to ensure I was taking advantage of every legal strategy available to someone in my income bracket, and a real estate agent to help me find a suitable place to live. Because I wasn't going back to Cedar Falls. That woman, the one who'd lived in a one-bedroom apartment and worried about heating bills, was gone. I was someone else now, someone who could afford to reinvent herself completely. The penthouse I eventually bought was in the most exclusive building in Minneapolis, 40 floors above the street with views of the river and the skyline. It came fully furnished with art that the previous owner's decorator had selected, but I hired my own designer to make it reflect my personality rather than someone else's idea of good taste. I wanted to feel like a home, I told Margaret, the interior designer who specialized in high-end residential projects, but also like a place where serious business gets done. I want people to feel comfortable here, but also to understand that they're dealing with someone important. Margaret, who'd worked with tech billionaires and old money families, nodded as if she understood exactly what I meant. Approachable luxury, she said. Sophisticated, but not intimidating. I think we can create something that reflects both your warmth and your success. Success. I was learning to think of myself as successful, even though my success had come through inheritance rather than achievement. But the more I moved through the world as a wealthy woman, the more I understood that the source of money mattered less than the confidence it provided. People treated me differently now. Hotel staff anticipated my needs before I voiced them. Store clerks competed for my attention. Contractors returned my calls immediately and arrived precisely on time. It wasn't just the money, it was the way money changed how I carried myself, how I spoke, how I expected to be treated. And slowly, I began to understand something that would have shocked the woman I'd been just weeks earlier. I was good at being rich. I had an intuitive understanding of investments that impressed my financial advisors. I could evaluate real estate with the same analytical skills I'd once used to stretch a tight household budget. I understood the psychology of negotiations from years of making every dollar count, and now I had the resources to back up my instincts. You have excellent judgment, Mrs. Whitmore. My wealth manager told me after I suggested a portfolio adjustment that outperformed his original recommendation by 12%. Have you considered expanding your investment activities? There are opportunities for someone with your capital and insight. I was considering a lot of things, but my primary focus remained on Bradley Morrison and the son who'd chosen him over me. Victoria's preliminary report arrived 3 weeks after I'd hired her, delivered in a sealed envelope that felt heavy with possibilities. I read it in my new living room, surrounded by furniture that cost more than most people's cars, with classical music playing softly in the background and a cup of tea that had been imported from a plantation I could probably afford to buy. The information was even more interesting than I'd hoped. Bradley Morrison's financial situation was far more precarious than his lifestyle suggested. He earned a substantial salary at his investment firm, but he spent even more substantially. The BMW was leased, not owned. The house in Chicago carried a mortgage that consumed 40% of his income. His credit cards were maxed out, and he'd borrowed against his 401k twice in the past 3 years. More interesting were the details about his professional conduct. There had been client complaints about aggressive sales tactics and investment recommendations that served Bradley's commission structure better than his clients' interests. Nothing actionable yet, but enough to create a pattern that the right regulatory agency might find very interesting. But the most fascinating discovery was personal. Bradley had been having an affair with a colleague for over a year. Someone named Amanda Chen, who worked in the same firm and who'd apparently been under the impression that Bradley was planning to leave Daniel for her. I set down the report and walked to my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city lights that twinkled like stars I could reach out and pluck from the sky. Bradley Morrison had built his life on a foundation of deception, debt, and betrayal. All I had to do was apply the right pressure in the right places, and it would all come tumbling down. But first, I needed to let Daniel know I was still alive. After a month of silence, it was time to remind him that his mother hadn't simply vanished into thin air when he abandoned her. I picked up my phone and dialed his number, no longer the desperate woman leaving pleading voicemails. When he answered, his voice was cautious, guilty. "Mom? Oh God, Mom. Where have you been? I've been so worried." "Have you?" I interrupted, my voice calm and measured. "That's interesting, Daniel, because you left me stranded in Minneapolis with no money and no way to get home. I'm curious what exactly you've been worried about." "There was a mix-up," he said quickly. "Bradley's conference ran over, and we had to leave early for a family emergency on his side. We tried to call." "No, you didn't," I said gently. "But that's all right. The abandonment turned out to be exactly what I needed." "Mom, I don't understand. Where are you? Are you okay? Do you need money for a bus ticket?" I smiled, looking around my penthouse with its million-dollar view and its custom furniture and its art collection that would make most museums jealous.
I'm fine, sweetheart.
Better than fine, actually. I'm in Minneapolis, and I've decided to stay for a while. I'm enjoying the city much more than I expected. You're staying?
But how?
Where are you getting money? Oh, that's a long story, I said. Perhaps we should save it for when you visit me. I'd love to show you my new place. Your new place? I bought a penthouse downtown, 40 floors up, with the most amazing views. You and Bradley will have to come see it sometime. I think Bradley especially would appreciate the luxury of it all. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was small and confused. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening." "I know you don't, sweetheart. But you will. Give my regards to Bradley, won't you? Tell him I said thank you." "Thank you for what?" "For teaching me who I really am." I hung up before he could respond, and immediately called Victoria Hamilton. "It's time," I said when she answered. "I'm ready to begin." The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing investment portfolios with my financial advisor. My assistant, yes, I had an assistant now, a sharp young woman named Jennifer who managed my increasingly complex schedule, knocked softly on my home office door. "Mrs. Whitmore? I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a Daniel Morrison on the line. He says he's your son, and it's urgent." I'd been expecting this call for 2 weeks, ever since Victoria's team had begun implementing the first phase of our plan. "Tell him I'll be with him in just a moment," I said, finishing my signature on a document that would move another $1 million into a renewable energy fund that was both profitable and personally satisfying. When I picked up the phone, Daniel's voice was strained with barely controlled panic. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" "Good morning to you too, sweetheart," I said pleasantly. "How are you and Bradley doing?" "Don't play games with me. Someone's been investigating Bradley's company." Financial regulators showed up at his office yesterday asking questions about client complaints and commission structures. They had files, Mom. Detailed files about transactions going back years. "How interesting," I said, making a note to send Victoria a bonus. "I hope everything's in order." Of course it's in order. But why would regulators suddenly be interested in Bradley's business practices? This kind of investigation doesn't just happen randomly, doesn't it? I wouldn't know. I'm not familiar with how these things work. "Mom." Daniel's voice dropped to the tone he'd used as a child when he was trying to determine if I knew about the broken lamp or the missing cookies. Do you know something about this? I paused, letting the silence stretch between us like a rubber band ready to snap. Daniel, when you and Bradley left me at that motel, what did you think would happen to me? We didn't leave you. Yes, you did, I said, my voice still pleasant but with steel underneath. You brought me to Minneapolis, abandoned me in a cheap motel with no money and no way home, and drove away. I'm curious what outcome you expected from that scenario. Bradley thought maybe if you had to manage on your own for a while, you'd realize you needed help, that you'd be more open to discussing assisted living options. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away, even though I'd suspected as much. They deliberately put me in a desperate situation to force me into compliance with their plans for my future. Assisted living, I repeated. How thoughtful. And did either of you consider that I might die in that motel room? That a 72-year-old woman with no resources might not survive being abandoned 300 miles from home? Mom, you're being dramatic. Am I? Because I have security footage from the Continental in that shows me counting $17 in bills and change in the parking lot, trying to figure out how to make it last until someone rescued me. I have phone records showing 43 unanswered calls to your number. I have documentation from social services about the assistance programs I had to apply for because my own son threw me away like garbage. Daniel was quiet for so long I thought he might have hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was very small. We never meant for it to go that far. What did you mean, then? Exactly what outcome were you hoping for when you left me with no money and no way home? We thought you'd call us. We thought after a day or two, you'd be ready to have a real conversation about your future. My future according to whom? According to Bradley, who decided I was an inconvenient burden. According to you, who apparently values your husband's opinion more than your mother's life. That's not fair. Fair. I laughed, a sound that held no warmth. Daniel, you want to talk about fair? Let me tell you what I think is fair. I think it's fair that Bradley's regulatory troubles are just beginning. I think it's fair that his colleagues are starting to ask questions about his ethics and his financial stability. I think it's fair that his clients are being contacted by investigators who are very interested in his sales practices. You can't do this to him. He's my husband. He's the man who convinced you to abandon your mother. The man who calculated that I was disposable and acted on that calculation. The man who's about to learn that every action has consequences, especially when you target someone with the resources to fight back. Resources? Mom, what are you talking about? You live on Social Security and a tiny pension. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the revelation I'd been savoring like fine wine. Actually, Daniel, I'm worth about $12.5 million. Give or take a few $100,000, depending on market fluctuations. The silence on the other end of the line was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. What? $12.5 million, I repeated slowly, enunciating each word. From stock I inherited 37 years ago and forgot about until you abandoned me. The company was acquired 6 months ago, and the payout was substantial. That's impossible. The account statements are quite real, I assure you. Would you like me to have my wealth management team send you copies? They're very thorough. But you were living in that tiny apartment. You were struggling to pay bills. You asked us for help. I never asked you for help, Daniel. You offered, and I declined because I had too much pride to accept charity for my son. But I also never told you about assets you had no business knowing about. Money I'd planned to leave to you, by the way, before you demonstrated that you saw me as a burden rather than a mother. I could hear him crying now, soft sounds that might have moved me a month ago. Now they just reminded me of all the times I'd cried myself to sleep in that motel room, wondering if my own child cared whether I lived or died. "Mom, please," he said through his tears.
I'm sorry.
"We're both sorry. We made a terrible mistake." "Yes, you did. And now you're going to live with the consequences of that mistake. What do you want from us? Money? An apology? I'll do anything." "I don't want anything from you, Daniel. I want you to understand who you chose to become when you let Bradley convince you to throw me away. I want you to live with the knowledge that you abandoned a woman worth millions of dollars because you decided she was worthless." "And Bradley?" I smiled, looking out at the city spread below my penthouse windows. "Bradley's consequences are just beginning. The regulatory investigation is only the first move. I'm a very patient woman, and I have the resources to be thorough. By the time I'm finished, he'll understand exactly how expensive it was to underestimate me." "Mom, you can't destroy his career over this. He has clients who depend on him, colleagues who respect him. He should have thought about that before he decided I was disposable," I said. "But don't worry, Daniel. I'm not going to destroy his career. I'm going to let him do that himself. I'm just going to make sure the right people are paying attention when he does." I hung up before he could respond and immediately called Victoria Hamilton. "The sun knows," I told her. "It's time for phase 2. "Understood," Victoria said. "We'll have Amanda Chin contacted by someone claiming to represent a divorce attorney. Anonymous tip about her affair with Bradley, with suggestions that she might want to distance herself professionally before the scandal breaks. And the financial irregularities. We're releasing those to the SEC and the Illinois Financial Regulatory Board simultaneously. By Friday, Bradley Morrison will be under formal investigation by multiple agencies." Perfect. I walked to my windows and looked down at the city where I'd been abandoned and reborn. What about the personal elements? Those take a bit more finesse, but we're ready. The affair details go to Daniel, of course, but also to Bradley's professional networks. Amazing how quickly trust evaporates when people realize someone has been lying about their personal life. It was amazing, and it was about to get more amazing. Because Bradley Morrison had made the mistake of thinking that power came from money alone. He'd never understood that real power came from knowing how to use money strategically, patiently, with the precision of a surgeon and the determination of someone who'd been given nothing left to lose. The woman he'd abandoned at the Continental Inn had been powerless, desperate, easy to discard. The woman implementing his destruction from a penthouse 40 floors above the street was something else entirely. She was someone who understood that revenge, when properly planned and adequately funded, could be the most satisfying investment of all. The first domino fell on a Friday afternoon in November, exactly 6 weeks after my phone conversation with Daniel. Victoria called me while I was having lunch with my art consultant, discussing which pieces to add to my collection. "It's done," she said simply. "Bradley Morrison has been terminated from his position, effective immediately." The firm cited irregularities in client relations and failure to maintain professional standards in their press release. I excused myself from lunch and walked to my office windows, looking down at the city where I'd been abandoned for months ago. What about the regulatory investigation? Still ongoing, but the termination essentially confirms their suspicions. Once word spreads that his own firm couldn't stand behind him, other agencies will start looking more closely at his practices. He's essentially radioactive now in the financial services industry. And personally, Victoria's voice carried a note of satisfaction. Amanda Chin filed a harassment complaint yesterday, claiming Bradley had been pressuring her to leave her husband. Apparently, she's decided that her marriage is more important than her affair with a man who's about to lose everything. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle over me like a warm coat. What's next? That depends on how far you want to take this, Mrs. Whitmore. We could stop here. He's already facing professional ruin and personal humiliation. Or we could continue with the financial pressure. The choice is yours. I thought about that morning 4 months ago when I'd stood at a bank counter with $12.37 to my name, abandoned by the people I'd loved most in the world. I thought about the social services forms I'd filled out in a motel room, preparing to become a ward of the state because my own son had decided I was disposable. Continue, I said. The beautiful thing about Bradley's situation was that his own choices were making my revenge easier than I'd anticipated. When you build your life on debt and deception, it doesn't take much pressure to bring the whole structure crashing down. His mortgage company, suddenly nervous about his employment status, accelerated the terms of his loan. His credit card companies, reviewing accounts triggered by his job loss, discovered spending patterns that didn't align with his declared income. The IRS, prompted by an anonymous tip about unreported income from his side consulting work, opened an audit that would tie up his finances for months. But the most devastating blow was personal. Daniel called me 3 weeks after Bradley's termination, his voice hollow with betrayal and exhaustion. "He's been lying to me about everything," Daniel said without preamble. "The affair, the money problems, the debt. Mom, we're going to lose the house." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and was surprised to find that I meant it. Despite everything, I didn't enjoy hearing the pain in my son's voice. "Bradley said you were behind all this. The investigation, the termination, everything. He said you hired people to destroy his life." "I hired people to investigate his business practices," I corrected. "Everything else was already there, waiting to be discovered. I just made sure the right people were paying attention." "But why?" "I know we hurt you, but this is destroying everything we built together." "What you built together was constructed on lies, Daniel. Bradley's professional misconduct, his financial irresponsibility, his affair, I didn't create any of those problems. I just stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own choices." "So this is revenge? You're destroying my marriage to get back at us for leaving you in Minneapolis?" I considered the question seriously. "In part, yes. But it's more than that. Bradley Morrison calculated that I was worthless, someone who could be discarded without consequences. I wanted him to understand how wrong he was. I wanted both of you to understand. And now you do." Daniel was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I understand that my mother is capable of destroying lives when she's angry." "No," I said gently. "You understand that your mother is capable of protecting herself when she's threatened. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you used your money to ruin an innocent man's career." "Innocent?" I laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Daniel, Bradley Morrison committed securities violations. He had an affair while married to you. He convinced you to abandon your mother because he saw her as a financial burden. Which part of that strikes you as innocent?" The investigation found minor infractions at worst. The investigation found a pattern of behavior that violated both professional ethics and federal regulations. The fact that other people in his industry get away with similar conduct doesn't make it legal or ethical. "And the affair?" I paused, hearing the pain in his voice. This was my son, the child I'd raised and loved, and his world was crumbling around him. But he'd made choices that led to this moment, just as Bradley had. "I didn't make Bradley cheat on you, Daniel. I just made sure you found out about it. By hiring investigators to dig into our private life. By hiring investigators to find out who I was dealing with. The affair was simply part of what they discovered." Daniel was crying now, the soft sounds carrying through the phone like an accusation. "Mom, please. Can't you just stop this? Haven't you punished us enough?" "I'm not punishing you, sweetheart. I'm allowing you to experience the natural consequences of your choices. You chose to abandon me because Bradley convinced you I was worthless. Now you're learning what kind of man Bradley really is and what it costs to align yourself with someone like that." "But I'm your son. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" The question hit me like a physical blow, because of course it meant everything to me. Daniel was still my child, still the boy I'd raised and sacrificed for, and loved beyond reason. But he was also the man who'd left me stranded with no money and no way home, who'd chosen his husband's comfort over his mother's survival. It means I love you enough to let you face the truth about the choices you've made, I said finally. It means I love you enough to show you what happens when you betray the people who love you unconditionally. And if I leave him, if I divorce Bradley and try to start over, will you help me? Do you want to leave him because you've realized he's not the man you thought he was, or because staying with him is financially inconvenient now that his true nature has been exposed? Another long silence. I don't know, Daniel admitted. I honestly don't know the difference anymore. Then you're not ready to start over yet, I said gently. When you figure out the difference between love and convenience, between loyalty and enabling, then we can talk about your future. And until then? Until then, you live with the consequences of your choices, just like Bradley is living with his. I hung up and stood at my windows, looking out at the city lights that had become as familiar as old friends. For months ago, I'd been a powerless old woman abandoned by her family. Now I was someone who could destroy lives with a phone call, who could move millions of dollars with the stroke of a pen, who commanded the kind of respect that money and strategic thinking could buy. But more than that, I was someone who'd learned the difference between being loved and being needed, between being family and being convenient. Bradley had taught me that lesson when he calculated my worth and found me wanting. Daniel had reinforced it when he chose his husband's comfort over his mother's survival. Now they were both learning what it cost to underestimate someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The game wasn't over yet. But for the first time in months, I knew exactly who was winning. 2 years have passed since that morning when I stood abandoned at the Continental Inn with $17 in my purse and the certainty that my life was over. As I write this, I'm sitting in the library of my penthouse, surrounded by first edition books and original artwork, looking out at a city that has become my kingdom rather than my prison. Daniel and Bradley's marriage ended 8 months after our last phone conversation. The divorce was bitter and expensive, fought over assets that turned out to be mostly debt disguised as prosperity. Bradley disappeared somewhere on the West Coast, reportedly working as an insurance salesman under his middle name to avoid the professional reputation that followed him wherever his real identity was known. Daniel moved back to Cedar Falls, not far from the apartment where I used to count pennies and worry about heating bills. He's working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, living modestly in a way that I suspect has taught him things about humility and authenticity that his marriage to Bradley never could. He calls me every few weeks now. Our conversations are careful, formal things, like negotiations between former enemies who've agreed to a tentative ceasefire. He apologizes frequently, sometimes in the middle of conversations about completely unrelated topics, as if he can't quite believe what he did to me and needs constant reassurance that I've forgiven him. I haven't forgiven him. Not yet. But I love him, and I'm learning that those are two different things. I understand now why you did what you did, he told me during our most recent call. Bradley was poison. He turned me into someone I didn't recognize.
No, I correcte, Janley.
Bradley revealed who you were willing to become when someone offered you permission to abandon your principles. There's a difference. Have I lost you forever, Mom? Is there any way back from what I did? I don't know yet, I answered honestly. But I'm willing to find out if you are. Because that's what I've learned in these 2 years of wealth and power and strategic revenge, that love and consequences can coexist, that you can care about someone while still holding them accountable for their choices. That forgiveness, when it comes, has to be earned rather than expected. My life now bears no resemblance to the existence I had before Minneapolis. I serve on the boards of 3 charitable foundations, focusing on organizations that help elderly women who've been abandoned by their families or left destitute by circumstances beyond their control. I've endowed a scholarship fund at the local university for older students returning to education after life-changing events. I've quietly funded housing assistance programs and food banks in a dozen cities, places where women like the one I used to be can find help without shame. The Continental Inn, where I spent the worst week of my life, is now a transitional housing facility for women in crisis. I bought the building, renovated it completely, and turned it into a place where dignity and hope are preserved even when everything else has been lost. Maria, the young mother who befriended me during my stay, manages the facility now. Janet helps with intake and counseling. Even Frank found a role, maintaining the gardens and providing the kind of gruff kindness that people in desperate situations sometimes need most. "You saved our lives," Maria told me at the facility's opening ceremony. "All of us, in different ways." "You saved mine first," I replied and meant it. Because it was their kindness during my darkest moment that reminded me who I wanted to be, even when I had the power to be someone else entirely. The revenge I took on Bradley was thorough and complete, but it wasn't the most important thing I accomplished. The most important thing was learning that being abandoned doesn't have to mean being powerless, that starting over at 72 is not only possible, but can be transformative in ways I never imagined. I'm not the same woman who worried about heating bills and counted pennies for bus fare. But I'm also not the woman who systematically destroyed a man's life because he underestimated her. I'm someone in between, someone who learned that wealth is a tool that can be used for revenge or for redemption, and that the choice between those options reveals everything about who you choose to be. My financial advisors tell me that my investments have grown to nearly $20 million. My lawyers have helped me structure my estate in ways that will fund charitable work for decades after I'm gone. My household staff, yes, I have household staff now, treat me with a kind of respect that comes from knowing they work for someone who values their dignity as much as their service. But the most valuable thing I've acquired isn't money or property or influence. It's the understanding that you can't be abandoned by someone who never truly valued you in the first place, and that discovering your own worth is sometimes worth every painful step of the journey that leads you there. Daniel will have to find his own way back to being the man I raised him to be, if that's who he chooses to become. Bradley will have to live with the consequences of underestimating someone he should have treated with basic human decency. And I will continue building a life that honors both the woman I was and the woman I discovered I could be when everything I thought I knew about myself was stripped away. The train that pulled away from that station in Minneapolis, leaving me standing there with nothing, was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because sometimes you have to lose everything you think defines you to discover who you actually are. And sometimes the person you discover is more powerful than you ever imagined possible. I am Melinda Whitmore. I am 74 years old. I am worth $20 million and growing. I was abandoned by my family and left for dead in a cheap motel. And I have never been more grateful for anything in my life. Because the woman who was thrown away discovered that she was actually irreplaceable. She just hadn't known it yet. Thank you for joining us for this extraordinary story of resilience and transformation. If Melinda's journey moved you, please subscribe to her journey for more real tales of women rising from the ashes of betrayal to discover their own hidden power. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to rewrite your own story, and that sometimes the most devastating abandonment can become the greatest liberation. What would you have done in Melinda's situation? Was her response justified, or should she have simply forgiven and moved on? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, your true journey is just getting started, no matter what age you are or what circumstances you're facing. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, because every woman deserves to know that her story isn't over until she decides it's over. And sometimes, the The best chapters are the ones written after everyone else has given up on you. Thanks for watching her journey, where we believe that every setback can become the setup for an even greater comeback.